Let's just talk about bombing, okay? We've been talking a lot about the bombing against Ukrainian cities. We've been talking a lot about the drone strikes. We've been talking a lot about the missile strikes and the lack of Patriot missiles for Ukrainian interceptors, the lack of sufficient air defense systems and Western interceptors that are coming down the pipe, and how the Europeans still have yet to agree on sending a new Patriot system because they, according to the Washington Post, are squabbling over things such as, well, if I send over my Patriot system from, Western Europe or wherever it is, places that is not being bombed, I want to make sure that when I get the replacement, I get a discount because I am the one taking the initiative to send this Patriot air defense system. And this is one of the reasons that it's being slowed down, because of these types of negotiations, as the Ukrainians are desperately trying to hold back the waves and waves and waves of the air attack. In the last missile strikes against Ukraine, out of 9 ballistic missiles that were fired at them, they intercepted none of them. And these ballistic missiles have killed children at playgrounds. They've struck civilians in Kiev and Ri. They've struck civilians in the Kiev region. Of course, everybody remembers that children's hospital that was struck. These things can kill hundreds upon hundreds of people when you talk about the payloads that they carry. And the fact that they're getting through with none of them being intercepted on any night is an indication that the interceptors are dangerously low. They don't have a significant amount of ammunition, and that deserves all of the attention in the world. But that's not what we're focusing on today. Instead, we're focusing on the inverse. We're focusing on the Ukrainians bombing Russia. Because as much as Ukraine has been taking some of the worst air attacks of the war, no, that's not true, the worst air attacks of the war, the Russians have been getting the inverse of that, which means the worst air attacks of the war for them, the largest spanning air attacks, the most drones. When I was reporting about what the Ukrainians were saying their production numbers were for this year, which doesn't just top previous year's production numbers for long range drones, their equivalent of the Shahed that they've been throwing at Russian military installations and oil refineries across the country. When I was talking about those numbers, it wasn't that it just was making more than last year or the year before. Their numbers said that you could take all the numbers for all the drones they produced in 2022, 2023, and 2024, combine them, and you've gotten a little bit more than half of the number that they're reporting for how many long-range drones they're making, to give you an idea of the scale of the increase in the investment that the Ukrainians have made into the long-range drone program. And so that's what the Ukrainians were saying. And just because the Ukrainians said it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But you want to know how I know it's true, even though I suspected it was true, because it would make sense that maybe it's not to that exact number, but that they're making massive investments and massively expanding production of these, because it made strategic sense. The way I knew for sure it was true is because the Russians were reporting it. The Russians were going from, we have single-digit attacks in the Moscow area, and like the big news story is a single drone flies through Moscow, blows up near this area. Now they're reporting triple-digit drone attacks, over 100 drones attacking in a single night. That wasn't happening in 2022. That wasn't happening in 2023. That really wasn't happening in 2024. That is happening in 2025, and that's happening regularly in 2025. And the targets that the Ukrainians are going after, many of them make a lot of military logic from the perspective of, anybody who's been following the war closely from the economic warfare perspective. They're targeting oil refineries. We've talked about this on the channel before. They're trying to make it so that one of the main ways that Russia fuels the war machine, which is through the energy sector, which is through the sale of crude oil, energy export, even if it's at a discount to the Chinese and the Indians, because of their, let's just say, disadvantageous negotiating position, it's still the lifeblood of the Russian war machine. And so they were targeting the oil refineries. This is part of the reason why I was concerned about the energy ceasefire. I was concerned about it for two reasons. One reason is that it was being put in place after it would have had the most effect and most benefit for the Ukrainians in the winter. The other reason is that as Ukrainian drone production was expanding and the amount of damage they could do to these oil refineries across the largest country in the world, which in most instances is an advantage militarily, but in this instance it's a disadvantage because that means you have a lot of area to cover with air defense systems. And so you can't cover every oil refinery. And so if they're firing over 100 drones any day of the week, it could be once, God, twice, 3 times a week, if they're doing that, they're going to hit oil refineries. And as the price of oil is going down, it went down to about $60, $65. And for the Russians, that means they're selling them at $50 a pop, probably because of this discount that they have to give the Russian, the Chinese, the discount they got to give themselves, the Chinese and the Indians. This means they're in a disadvantageous economic position when it comes to their energy sector. And if oil prices continue to go down due to increased production, due to the Saudis seemingly indicating that they're going to, produce a decent amount of oil, OPEC not being able to unite on bringing the price of oil up, up, and up. They haven't been able to do that due to certain nation states, let's just say, usurping the production numbers, one of them being the Russians, by the way. So this is partially the Russians actually, kind of making a mess for themselves when it comes to OPEC, even though it's not just OPEC. For example, if we talk about the United States, they're currently engaged in negotiations with the Iranians. They're engaged in negotiations with the Iranians that, if successful, could possibly indicate the introduction of Iranian energy export to a country that isn't named China. And what does that do for international oil prices? Well, let me tell you, it doesn't bring them up. Point is, there's a lot of potential pressures and avenues for oil prices to go down in the coming year. And if the Ukrainians at that moment where the Russians can't really sustain the war machine, if it gets to $30 a barrel, God forbid it goes to an Asia-style crisis like it was in the 90s and we go to $10 a barrel. But if it gets anywhere close to that, and they're targeting their energy refineries, that can do a lot of damage. And so when we say Zelensky doesn't have any cards, this is one of the cards Zelensky has to add pressure on the Russians as the war continues to drag on, and the Russians seem to give no interest in serious negotiations with conditions for peace that would be acceptable to any Ukrainian government. And when I say any Ukrainian government, I mean any Ukrainian government outside of that of Yanukovych, a reinstalled Yanukovych. And so this is one of the areas that the Russians have been feeling the pain when it comes to Ukrainian drone attacks. And part of the reason why I was semi-suspicious of the energy ceasefire, which didn't last for very long anyway, it seemed like. But the other major target that the Ukrainians have been going after has been military production. We're talking aviation factories. We're talking microchip production. We're talking mechanical goods. We're talking heavy industry. So if there's a CNC in sight, it should be sweating right now. Okay, CNC machines beware, the Ukrainian Air Force, the drone forces here. So we have a few pictures I wanted to show you. This is just one of the examples of one of these military factories being bombed. We do have some actual footage of these drone factory. Actually, I believe this is an aviation factory. No, this is a drone making factory. A separate factory got bombed that was an aviation factory, which is actually quite a major factory in Russia. I think it was part of the machinery section. I mean, aviation factory, a lot of it's the machinery section. Man, that's crazy to see. I haven't seen, I've seen a lot of footage of drones, but I've never seen footage of a drone where it's going like dead straight and it does the downturn. I've seen footage of drones like coming down during that like terminal velocity. I've seen footage of drones going straight. I've never actually seen the downturn. Mind you, these are not drones, likely. I cannot say this for sure. But if everything I know about most drones to be true, is that these drones are not operated by Ukrainians. they're fired by Ukrainians, but they're not operated by Ukrainians live. They have the coordinates pre-programmed in for what targets they want to hit. So that means that basically the pre-programmed flight path said it's now time to downturn. Anyway, there's a lot of videos like this. It's also interesting to listen to Russian reactions to this, because I watch Ukrainian reactions to siege strikes, and unless they're very close, most of them have become more tame with time, which I think is mostly just due to the fact that human beings adapt to their surroundings. And if you're constantly surrounded by war, constantly surrounded by anti-air fire, like I don't really even pay much attention sometimes to some of the very, very distant sounds of war, or sometimes the anti-air fire, or pay it like a very like minimal attention compared to what I used to, because it's been so much time. But a lot of Russians still haven't felt the war coming home, or it's come home on only a few occasions when it comes to these drones coming back. But this year is going to be very different. The most Russians of the entire war are going to feel the war coming back into their backyard, and that's saying something, considering last year was the big year of the Kursk incursion going into early this year. Here's another one. I wonder if we're going to see it come down. Free program path. Yep, there it is.
Он падает. Попал.
So there were a bunch of places where the Russian Air Force decided that's not my business. Okay, nuh-uh. I don't want that. And so they started getting Russian Air Force equipment, Russian Air Force aircraft, transport craft, airlift assets, anything they could grab on these airports, and they started yeeting them in every direction that wasn't getting pounded by drones. And so let me just throw out there that when it comes to the direct effect of these drones, there's a few ways you can measure them. The first way is with what equipment it damages. And that's very easy to point to, because you look at the building and say that building blew up. That, you know, there's the damage. You blew up an FSB building, you blew up some energy infrastructure, whatever it is. So that's one tangible way to feel the effects. The second tangible way, I would say, is probably with airport closures. Honestly, a lot of Russians are not enjoying a ton of airport closures, and I'm sure that has some economic effect. But the major other way I think this has an effect is on the constant movement of Russian air assets. By bringing the war further and further back into Russia, this doesn't only strain their air defense systems, this doesn't only bring the war back home, which I'm sure is on the minds of many Ukrainian commanders, and especially the mind of the Ukrainian government. I think this is something that motivates Zelensky. But if you want to protect your air assets from this mass amount of drones, or the possibility of Ukrainian ballistic missiles, which the ballistic missile program is still ongoing. We're hearing an announcement from the Russian government that they're going to work to try to produce long-range attack equipment, long-range equipment in Ukraine. So they're going to help the Ukrainians to produce equipment that can bomb Russia long-range into their territory, as they reassert the fact that Ukraine has the right to do long-range attacks. This is going to strain these aircraft to move from one airport to another airport to another airport to avoid getting bombed. And when you already have an airplane parts crisis, when you already have an air force that, while still big, it's still much more sizable than the Ukrainians, but they're having problems with not only the civilian aircraft industry, with some airplanes getting cannibalized and parts being taken for other aircraft, and a lot of planes having to come down, you know, last second because of some disaster in the skies. And this is in part due to, you know, sanctions policy and them not being able to import stuff. That's also affecting the aircraft of the Russian armed forces. And the more they have to shift these resources around, the more they strain the Russian Air Force, the more time they're going to have to spend on maintenance. The more time these aircraft are going to have to be spent being repaired or moving around or being, you know, protected from these types of attacks instead of bombing Ukraine. So I think that when we talk about the effect of this Ukrainian strategy, it isn't just measured by the direct burning of whatever equipment gets bombed. I think it also has, of course, a national psychological impact and a war economics impact, putting aside any, like, airport closures. I have a few more videos here as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the psychological impact because a lot of Russians are not used to this. They're not used to being bombed in this way. While, of course, anytime a bomb hits near your building is going to freak you out. After almost, going on 4 years of war now, going towards the fourth year, a lot of Russians still haven't felt the war coming back to them, and seeing these reactions is not only terrible, of course, for these people individually, but you can see the gulf in the experience, the everyday experience for the average Russian and Ukrainian, and how that might change going forward, which is, of course, a tragedy for more people having to experience the horrors of war. But at the end of the day, it's, nations invade others, and, the troubles they export overseas, or in this case to their neighbor, their brotherly nation, quote unquote, they can also import back home.
Что происходит? Я сейчас ничего не понимаю. Прилетела прямо возле моего дома. Просто какой-то пиздец. Что же это за кошмар происходит? Вот там просто все абсолютно попадало. Прилетела вот буквально в первый подъезд.
So she's talking about how she doesn't understand what's happening, and that the drone landed next to her house, and this is all terrible. This is like a bad dream, right? That's what she's talking about. But I don't think I need to translate anything or, do anything like that to have you guys understand, just from the look on her face, just the tone in her voice, that she's not having a fantastic time due to the bombing. And this is something that's going to affect more and more Russians. And I think that there is a benefit that Putin has through keeping people as isolated from the war as possible, by cannibalizing commercial banking sector, by trying to isolate the economic effects, by having this boom in the military economy to try to, even though if it's not sustainable, to try to cover up the long-term economic impacts that the war is going to have, as well as trying to isolate people from the daily violence, isolate people from the consequences. It can be comforting to somebody who wants to be apathetic towards their political surroundings, doesn't want to act, doesn't want to take action, or, someone of the belief that I don't really know what's true, I don't really know what's fake, so, what are you going to do? It's all above my pay grade. These are decisions that are not made by me. These are decisions made by somebody much above me. If you isolate them from the war, then they can have that position, generally speaking. But if you now put them in the position of having to go to the front or deal with the consequences of the war every day, being apathetic about what's now coming back to your kitchen table, coming back to your home, coming back to your backyard, it's a lot more difficult. I'm not saying that this is going to lead to any immediate policy differences. I'm just stating the truth that, a war is much more real when the explosions are in your backyard. Here's a question. Do we think that if during the Vietnam War, let's say 3 years into it, we started having, Viet Cong drones blowing up in Oregon or somewhere, how would that change the trajectory of the war? It's impossible to say, but what I will say is it probably would have some discouraging effects. Definitely as time goes on, and if the American Air Force and American air defense systems can't properly defend all of their cities and all of their military installations.
Иди сюда, идите. Сава, выключи вспышку. Сава, выключи вспышку выключи.
Тише. Нет.
Бегом, домам, бегом. Ничего не трогайте, оставьте потом.
Of course, I wish nothing but safety for all civilians, but I also hope that this war ends as soon as possible, so that these continued use of these weapons isn't even necessary. But I mean, if there's no end in sight. And so I'm just going to be blunt with these guys. These types of attacks are probably only going to expand. But due to the increased capacity Ukrainians going to have as their production continues to expand, and because the Ukrainians, I think completely see this now as a grinding war. This is a war where the Russians will to grind them down. And so instead of shooting the arrow, it's much easier to shoot the archer. It's less expensive. It costs less. Requires less resources, and so the Ukrainians decided to go after the factories that are producing the arrows instead of just shooting the arrows down. The Ukrainians have decided to, if they're going to be grinded down, try to grind down the Russian economy, try to grind down the Russian war machine with a longer range air campaign, and Europe seems to be on board now. The concerns about escalation that were expressed by the government of Olaf Scholz are gone. The long range approvals are not only there, but now it seems to be like they're talked about as if they're a given. That of course the Ukrainians can do long range strikes. These are the factories that are producing the bombs that are bombing them. I'm hearing the arguments that Ukrainians and many of Ukraine's advocates and others and commentators that have been making for 2 years now being openly adopted by European capitals, which is, interesting to see it at this stage of the war. But I mean, it makes sense considering the circumstance. Probably would have suited Ukraine much sooner, but here we are. Here is another piece of footage of a drone hitting a major cruise missile manufacturer north of Moscow. So Ukraine is going to do this throughout the whole of 2025. As long as the war is going on, they're going to continue this campaign. And if the war pauses, they're going to continue to produce drones at this increased capacity and put them into storage to be used at the point that the war reignites, which, considering the history, is one of many outcomes, but a particularly likely one, I would say. So this air campaign from the Ukrainians that we're seeing now is going to be the picture going forward, and it's just going to likely increase in capacity as time goes on through 2025 towards the end, when Ukrainian production capacity will probably expand to its largest extent, if that is, of course, that the Russians don't find a way to undermine it through industrial sabotage, bombing, which is a concern, which is part of the reason why the air defense is not just something that affects, of course, the humanitarian concerns of protecting your civilians, but also military industry, as the Russians would, on many occasions, probably prefer to bomb a military production site when it comes to the physical benefit that has on the battlefield versus a children's cancer ward. Let's just talk about bombing, okay?